Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. I am back today with another video. This video is going to be focusing on Marc Gasol. As a little bit of background, if you aren't familiar, the Memphis Grizzlies, I believe today or yesterday, announced that they are willing to listen to trade offers for both Marc Gasol and Mike Conley, basically as a sign that they are ready to start rebuilding. They basically gave it a good try this season to make a playoff push, and while they were 11 and 5 and the second seed to start off the season in their first 16 games, they have lost 17 of their last 20 games. I believe their current record is somewhere around 19 and 27. They are the 14 seed in the West, I believe, which that usually would be more like a 12 seed or an 11 seed, but this year, because the West is so stacked, they're actually the 14 seed. But they basically announced, yes, we are willing to start listening to trade offers, and we are basically looking into rebuilding. That being said, I have come up with some Marc Gasol trade possibilities that we could look at for him, and I will be going through them with you today. There are 6 of them. There's no particular order to these ones. I just basically compiled them and have them here for you. So without further ado, let's get into our first one. Actually, to start off quick, what I'm going to do is go through Marc Gasol's stats for the season. So this season, he has played 46 games. He's averaging 15 points per game, shooting 43% from the field, 35% from three, 76% from the line, and 8.5 to 9 rebounds a game, along with 1 steal and 1 block a game. The first trade I have is just a straight up trade him for Serge Ibaka. So him to the Raptors for Serge Ibaka. Now, what are the benefits and drawbacks of this trade? Serge Ibaka is younger than Marc Gasol. I believe Marc Gasol is 34 currently, and Serge Ibaka, let's see here. I believe Serge Ibaka is only around 30 years old or 29. I think he's around 29. So they're getting a younger player on the Grizzlies. Along with that, you are getting a guy that makes less money. Now, while it's not super noticeable, the money difference, he's making $3 million less. So you save a little bit with your salary cap if you want to go sign a guy for a $3 million contract or a mid-level exception even. That's close to a mid-level exception if you do some maneuvering around on your roster. So you save a little bit of money. You get a younger player who essentially does most of the same stuff that Marc Gasol does, and you can basically maintain him. You'll be a noticeably worse team, I think, just because Serge Ibaka does a lot of the same stuff Marc Gasol does, but he doesn't do it in the same way. Marc Gasol gets his points like as the main option on a team, where Serge Ibaka usually gets his points as like the 4th option on our team. It's sort of like when Serge went to Orlando, people were expecting the Oklahoma City Surge, but they were basically looking at him as like the first option on the team, and he didn't really succeed there, and they were doing very poorly. Not that Memphis would want to do very poorly, but if you're looking to rebuild, you likely want to get worse before you get better. Serge Ibaka would allow them to maintain a familiar style of play while being worse, not significantly worse, like a 10-win team, but like I think that their win rate would drop off this season even more than it already has. But they can still draw in some fans and remain somewhat competitive. It's kind of like a half measure. Not that they should do a half measure because you kind of want to be all in on a rebuild or not in on a rebuild, but maybe if they're not fully committed, which it seems like is right where they're at right now, maybe Toronto throws in a second round pick and they're willing to do the deal. As far as Toronto, yes, you are getting a player who's 5 years older, but everything they do almost like they're almost the same type of exact same type of player, but Marc Gasol basically just does everything slightly better than Serge. Like let me go through Serge's stats right here. 16 points a game this year, 7 rebounds, shooting 53% from the field and 28% from 3. Okay, so like Serge does shoot better from the field, but 7 percentage points worse from 3, 35% compared to 28%. So Marc Gasol is a better 3-point shooter. He can space the floor much better, which would help any playoff contender, especially one like Toronto trying to make a finals push. He also rebounds better than Serge Ibaka does, despite Serge being more athletic and equal in height to him, which I think is interesting. Also, Serge, let's see here. They're actually taking the same amount of shots per game, 12.7, which is pretty interesting. And Yeah, Serge shoots a higher percentage, but that's also because I think more of his shots are coming like as not alley oops, but shots like under the rim, whereas Marc Gasol is almost exclusively shooting from like um, the top of the key now, or like 3 pointers. Let's see here. Marc Gasol is shooting 4 threes a game out of his 12 and a half shots. So a third of his shots are coming from 3 point range. And then I think, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of his other shots are coming from just like mid range or like top of the key area. So he shoots a lot more from the outside than Serge does, actually. Okay, so moving on to our next trade after that one. I have Marc Gasol going to the Philadelphia 76ers. This is an interesting one in that I feel like Memphis is getting some interesting stuff back, although it would be a significant signal that they are going towards the rebuilding path. So I have Philly getting just Marc Gasol, and in return Memphis getting Wilson Chandler, Justin Patton, and Markelle Fultz. So it's obvious why Philly would want to do this. They get a good player who could play some power forward, much like his brother. Pau Gasol started as a center and then transitioned to power forward. I think Marc Gasol could do the exact same thing with the style of play he has. He's a good shooter, or a better shooter than any of the players that they're trading. Um, he can space the floor more for a team that desperately needs some more outside shooting. He can play off ball if you need him to play off ball, or you can run the offense through him as a big man, which is an advantage where most teams can't run their offense through a big man. So you get a lot of benefits for Philly. Um, at the same time, he does make $24 million a year and kind of bites into some of their salary cap space in the next coming off season. As for Memphis, you get Wilson Chandler, who you can start immediately, and he can be a very decent NBA starter. Then you also get Justin Patton, who's sort of just like a salary throw-in, but he's only like 22, 23 years old, so he could still have a lot of potential as a young player. You could even try, if he gets healthy at some point, you could try and start him next to Jaren Jackson and see how that goes. Okay, and then the last most interesting part probably is Markelle Fultz, who maybe just needs to change the scenery to get himself going again. It's not always the case. It can sometimes be the case, though. I think that he still has a lot of the potential he had when he was in college, and it's somehow just gotten lost in the shuffle. But maybe a change of scenery and just a fresh start could help him out. Also, he's been in Philly where there's been a lot of expectations to be great, and the number one pick expectations have been looming over him. But if he went to Memphis and if they were rebuilding, and let's say if Mike Conley somehow got traded too and they were going full rebuild, I feel like he'd be thrown like the 30 to 33 minutes a night that sometimes a young player needs, like a Trey Young right now, who's kind of in the situation where he's being told, just play a ton. We know you won't be great this first year, but you'll get a lot of experience under your belt and you'll be ready next year to improve a lot. Sort of like what happened to De'Aaron Fox last year. Not saying that that would happen to Markelle Fultz, but De'Aaron Fox just played a ton last year, was very rough around the edges, but got a lot of experience and came back a much more improved and polished player. Not saying it could happen for Markelle Fultz, but saying that it's a possibility, and why not roll the dice if you're Memphis? Get the opportunity to rebuild and get a higher draft pick than what you would get with things the way they are. You'd also, if Markelle Fultz somehow unlocks the potential that he's had, you kind of get two like first round picks for Marc Gasol, which is a pretty good haul, and expiring contract in Wilson Chandler. Next trade I have on here is Marc Gasol to the San Antonio Spurs in exchange for his brother Pau Gasol. This would be the second time in their careers that the brothers were traded for each other. I have the Spurs getting Marc Gasol and Garrett Temple, who actually used to play for the Spurs, in exchange for Pau Gasol, Davis Bertans, Bryn Forbes, and Derek White. Now you may be saying with between Bertans, Forbes, and White, the Spurs are giving up a lot just for Marc Gasol, but hear me out. These guys they're not what you think they are, in that I think people get confused with the Spurs system. They think like, oh, these players that come up from obscurity to become really good players. Pop is like the master of finding these guys. Yes, he is, but like look at a lot of the guys that Popovich supposedly found and went on to have amazing NBA. Like people thought that they were going to have these like really good careers after Pop discovered them out of nowhere. Okay, you have a guy, Gary Neal. I think uh, Gary Neal's a decent player, and he, with all due respect though, was out of the league by I think 2014 or 15, and he was basically like discovered in like 2011. but like the year after he left the Spurs, he kind of fell off, and then no one ever heard of him again. Other guys, Tiago Splitter, I think played 1 year once he left the Spurs, and then he was gone. But he was supposed to be a guy that kind of Popovich made something out of nothing with. Along with that, you have guys like uh, okay, they're not at the top of my head, but like Marco Bellinelli, he was a guy that was supposed to like be a great sixth man after he left the Spurs, and he was like a decent player, but by no means like a great like sixth man who was he was supposed to basically be on equal footing as JJ Redick after he left the Spurs, and he wasn't. There's a lot of examples like this, and I really feel like Bertans, Bryn Forbes, and Derek White. People kind of think those are the next Danny Green or the next Tony Parker, who Pop brings in a guy out of nowhere and they become really good. But I don't think that that's what these guys are. I think they're just solid role players like a Gary Neal. That being said, Davis Bertans is making 45% of his threes this year, and Bryn Forbes and Derek White are on super cheap contracts and are proving that they can be effective NBA players for essentially dirt cheap contracts. And I think when you're a rebuilding team, that's exactly what you want. Competent guys who aren't that good, so you can tell your fan base you're trying, but at the same time, you can lose a lot of games and you can get high draft picks. Marc Gasol is essentially just salary cap throw in here. As for the Spurs side, which is much more interesting, you bring in Marc Gasol, who plays great off the dribble or on the dribble. You can run the offense through him, and you can run offense to the top of the key, which is what they used to love to do with Tim Duncan. They like to do that a lot now with Aldridge, actually. They actually like to work a lot with the mid-range game, and even though a lot of teams have gone away from that, Marc Gasol loves the mid-range game. As I said earlier, he shoots a lot of shots from the top of the key, and he can shoot some three-pointers too, which this team needs, some spacing. Okay, so you're looking at after this trade, the starting lineup for the Spurs. It'd probably look like Garrett Temple, DeMar DeRozan, Rudy Gay, LaMarcus Aldridge, and Marc Gasol, which would be pretty solid, and I think would almost lock them in as a playoff team. So I like this trade for them. Actually, you'd probably see Patty Mills as their starting point guard. Excuse me, not Garrett Temple. He can play some combo guard, but he's really settled more into a shooting guard role, anyways. So there you go. The Spurs get a solid third wheel for their team, and Memphis gets to rebuild with some solid role players. This next one would be a really odd one, I think. If Charlotte was like trying to prove that they can be a playoff contender, they'd make this trade. And it's just a salary dump completely on both sides. Okay, so I have Memphis receiving Nicholas Batum, Bismack Biyombo, and Cody Zeller, and I have Charlotte receiving Marc Gasol and Chandler Parsons. In total, there is $102 million being exchanged between these five players going to either team. Okay, so like, what are the benefits for Memphis? You get rid of Chandler Parsons, dead money, and basically you're allowed to tank. But you also, like the last trade, you bring in players who are competent but really just not that good, so that you can sort of seem like you're trying, but you'll basically be bad. You also get a promising young center in Cody Zeller, who isn't gonna ever be an all-star by any means, but he can be a solid starter next to Jaren Jackson. You can kind of allow Jackson to have the spotlight, and he can grow and develop as a player. And you're not just throwing a terrible player next to him, like when I suggested you start Justin Patton. That's actually kind of a joke, because Justin Patton really hasn't proven that he can be much of anything in this league in his 2 years where he's barely played at all. But Cody Zeller, you can say, okay, he's a competent starter who knows how to play. He can help Jaren develop a little bit because he's been the young guy in the league pretty recently. But then you can really open up the gates for Jaren Jackson to be a star, and also open up the opportunity for Memphis to get a high draft pick going forward. That being said, for Charlotte, you take an albatross back in Chandler Parsons, but then again, you take away easily the best player in the trade of Marc Gasol. And yes, Chandler Parsons is dead money, but essentially so is Bismack Biyombo, who you really weren't playing that much anyways. So you get an immediate upgrade at center and Marc Gasol. Your starting lineup after this probably looks like Kemba, Jeremy Lamb, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, Marvin Williams, and Marc Gasol. So you acquire a guy who would be the second best player on your team. You can probably solidify a playoff berth with him. You can maybe convince Kemba Walker, like, look, we're trying to acquire talent and become better, and they can try and entice him to stay by saying, like, look, we got Marc Gasol, another all-star for you to play with. So maybe that would somehow work into them convincing Kemba to stay. But if Kemba walks in free agency, this really wouldn't be this would be a meaningless trade for them to make. But this would basically all be in an effort to like try and sway Kemba to stay and make the playoffs this year. Next one I have Marc Gasol going to the Nets for the same reasons to try and solidify a playoff berth and kind of capitalize on the Nets extremely overachieving. So I have the Nets acquiring Marc Gasol, and I have Memphis acquiring Allen Crabbe and Jared Dudley and a second round pick. I feel like just Allen Crabbe and Jared Dudley aren't enough for an all-star level player, so I have the second round pick as just a slight sweetener. The main positives for Memphis here are that again they can tank and they can secure a high draft pick and kind of fully hit the rebuild button. Allen Crabbe and Jared Dudley they probably play Crabbe but not really Dudley, and both have expiring contracts. So you free up 28 million in the offseason by getting those two guys, and so you have a lot of cap space. You're gonna have a high draft pick from not being a great team, and you're gonna be able to pair a top 5 pick with Jaren Jackson, and also you have 28 million dollars to do with as you please in free agency. To me, that looks a lot better than having a 35-year-old Marc Gasol who's making 25 million along with Mike Conley and Jaren Jackson and being a 35-win team getting the 9th or 10th pick in the draft where you really don't have an identity. That draft pick isn't really going to help you all that much, and the next year you're probably going to be in the exact same spot. At least by making this move, they take a distinct foot forward in a direction and kind of make plans for the future. And for the Nets, you acquire a guy who's arguably your best player, and you probably solidify your playoff status. The last trade on here I have is the one I like the most. It is definitely again a salary dump for the Grizzlies, who would just be trying to secure a higher lottery pick and freeing up cap space. I have them acquiring Zach Randolph, Iman Shumpert, and Kosta Koufos, all expiring contracts who add up to 31 million in exchange for Marc Gasol and a throw-in and Ivan Rabb, who I don't think would really play at all for the Kings, considering they already have a super crowded front court. Okay, that being said, for the Grizzlies, again, I don't really think. Well, you probably play Iman Shumpert and a little bit of Kosta Koufos. Zach Randolph for sure wouldn't play. But you get these guys who basically you're going to let go of all of them in free agency in the offseason. You have a higher draft pick, and then you have $31 million in cap space to do with as you please. And then I also would say a second round pick they should receive in this. So you get a draft pick. You get a chance to rebuild quicker, more efficiently than I think if you keep Marc Gasol and just wait for him and Conley to get old and then you start your rebuild. As for Sacramento, you get a center in his the end of his prime and Marc Gasol who can kind of guide them, maybe help them make a playoff push because they're still in the conversation. I think they're either 500 or one game above 500, and they're like the 9 seed, so they could still contend for the playoffs this year. Starting lineup after this trade would probably look something like De'Aaron Fox. Then you'd probably have Buddy Hield, Bogdan Bogdanovic, Marc Gasol, and Willie Cauley-Stein with your sixth man being like Bielitsa. So you'd have some good shooting presence out there, and then you'd also have a good sixth man. You basically, I think you improve your defensive prowess and your offensive prowess, and you really don't give up that much because Iman Shumpert was really the only guy giving significant contributions, but even he's tapered off a bit, so you basically give up salary flexibility for a proven player, and for Memphis, you get a lot of salary flexibility in exchange for getting a lot worse. But you're trying to rebuild, so it's worth it. So this is a trade I like the best, and that's it, guys. Those are all the trades I compiled for Marc Gasol. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you found it interesting. If you have any trade suggestions for Marc Gasol that you want to share with me, leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to discuss them with you. Again, hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a good day. Bye.